They didn't just hurt you, they miscalculated you. And now they're living with the consequences they never prepared for. Because when they treat someone genuinely caring badly, something shifts. And deep down, they know they crossed a line they can't easily undo. If you've ever walked away wondering whether they realize what they did, stay with me because the truth is not always spoken, but it shows up in their behavior. When someone recognizes the loss of a stable emotional anchor, it does not usually happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, often in quiet moments where the absence of something familiar becomes impossible to ignore. That something is not just a person. It is the role that person played in creating emotional stability within the dynamic. A stable emotional anchor is the individual who brings consistency, understanding, and continuity into a relationship. The one who listens, who responds thoughtfully, who remains present even when things become difficult. The one who absorbs tension, tries to make sense of conflict, and works to restore balance when it is lost. This role is often carried by someone deeply empathetic, someone who values connection enough to maintain it even under strain. For a long time, that presence may have been taken for granted, not necessarily dismissed outright, but not fully recognized for what it was. Because when stability is always there, it becomes invisible. It feels normal, expected, like something that will continue regardless of what happens. But when that stability is removed, when the person who provided it begins to withdraw, step back, or disengage, that is when its true value becomes visible. At first, the absence may not seem significant. There may be an assumption that things will return to normal, that the connection will reestablish itself in the same way it always has. But as time passes and the familiar responses do not return, something begins to shift. The emotional environment changes. What once felt steady now feels inconsistent. What once felt manageable now feels uncertain, because the person who was quietly holding the emotional structure together is no longer doing so. And without that stabilizing presence, the dynamic begins to feel different. Conversations may feel less grounded. Moments of tension may linger longer. There is no longer an immediate return to balance after disruption. And this is where recognition begins, not always consciously, but experientially. There is a sense that something is missing, not just interaction, but regulation, because a stable emotional anchor does more than participate. They regulate the emotional tone of the relationship. They soften intensity. They bring perspective. They create a sense of continuity even when things are not going well. Without that, the dynamic loses its center. For the person who once relied on that stability, this can create discomfort. Because what was once predictable is now uncertain. What once felt controlled is now inconsistent, and this inconsistency is not something that can be easily corrected because it is not caused by a single event. It is caused by the absence of a pattern, the pattern of you being there, the pattern of you responding, the pattern of you maintaining the connection. And when that pattern disappears, the system must adjust. But adjustment is not immediate. There may be attempts to restore what was lost, not necessarily through direct acknowledgement, but through behavior, attempts to re-engage, to reconnect, to bring things back to a familiar place. But what is often overlooked is that the anchor is no longer in the same position. You are no longer providing the same level of stability. You are no longer absorbing the same level of emotional responsibility. You are no longer maintaining the same level of continuity. And because of that, the dynamic cannot return to what it was. This is where the realization deepens. Because it becomes clear, not necessarily in words, but in experience, that something important has changed, that the stability that once existed was not automatic. It was provided, it was sustained, and now it is absent. For you, this stage often brings clarity. You begin to see how much of the emotional balance you were carrying, how often you were the one restoring calm, how frequently you were the one maintaining connection even when it was difficult. And with that awareness, your perspective shifts. You are no longer questioning why things feel different. You understand why, because you are no longer functioning as the anchor. And that change is significant, because it means the relationship must now exist without the element that once held it together. And for the other person, this creates a new reality, one where stability is not guaranteed, one where emotional regulation is not externally provided, one where the absence of your presence is felt not just as distance, but as imbalance. This is not always expressed directly. It may not be acknowledged openly, but it is experienced through the difference, through the lack of ease, through the absence of something that once made the dynamic feel manageable. And this is where the true impact of your role becomes clear, not through words, but through what is no longer there. For you, this realization can be empowering because it shows you the value of what you brought into the relationship, not just emotionally, but structurally. You were not just part of the connection, you were part of what made it function. And now, without you in that role, the dynamic must face its own instability. And that is where everything changes. Because once the anchor is gone, the system can no longer rely on what once kept it steady. And in that absence, truth becomes visible, quietly, but undeniably. When control begins to slip and the familiar structure of the dynamic is no longer intact, one of the most revealing internal processes that takes place is the quiet replaying of the entire relationship. This is not something that is openly discussed or even consciously acknowledged at first. It happens internally, in moments of stillness, in the absence of distraction, when the usual patterns of interaction are no longer available to occupy attention. Replaying the dynamic is not about nostalgia. It is about trying to make sense of what no longer feels stable. For a long time, the relationship may have operated on a predictable rhythm. There were patterns of connection, of conflict, of distance, and of return. Even if those patterns were not healthy, they were familiar. They created a sense of continuity, a way of understanding how things worked. But when you step away, when your responses change, when your emotional availability decreases, when you no longer engage in the same cycles, that rhythm is disrupted. And without that rhythm, there is space. Space that was not there before. And in that space, the mind begins to revisit what has happened. Moments that once passed quickly are now revisited more slowly. Conversations are remembered. Reactions are reconsidered. Situations are viewed from a different angle. This replaying is not always comfortable because it introduces something that may not have been fully present before: perspective without immediate distraction. When the dynamic was active, there was constant engagement. Something was always happening: a message, a reaction, a response, a shift. And that constant movement left little room for reflection. But now, without that constant interaction, reflection becomes unavoidable. And reflection changes perception. What once felt justified may begin to feel questionable. What once seemed minor may begin to stand out. What once was dismissed may begin to carry more weight. This is where awareness starts to develop, not necessarily as a clear realization, but as a growing sense that something was not handled well. Because when you are no longer there to absorb, explain, or normalize what happened, the events exist on their own, without interpretation, without emotional buffering, without immediate repair. And in that unfiltered state, they can look different. This does not mean there is immediate accountability. It does not mean there is a clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But it does mean there is a shift in how the past is experienced. It is no longer just a sequence of events. It becomes something to think about, to revisit, to analyze. At the same time, the absence of control makes this process more intense. Because previously, there may have been a sense of influence over how the dynamic unfolded. Actions led to predictable responses. Behaviors produced familiar outcomes. There was a level of certainty in how things would progress. Now, that certainty is gone, and without it, the past becomes more significant, because it is the only reference point left. This is why replaying often increases when control decreases, because the present is no longer predictable, and the mind turns to the past to find understanding. There may be moments where specific interactions stand out, times when you responded with patience, times when you stayed engaged despite difficulty, times when you offered understanding or support. And these moments, when revisited without the noise of the ongoing dynamic, can take on new meaning. They are no longer just part of the flow. They become points of contrast, points where the stability you provided becomes more visible. At the same time, moments of conflict or tension may also be revisited. But now, without your immediate response to soften or redirect them, they can feel different, more exposed, more defined. And this is where the internal shift begins to deepen. Because the replay is not just about remembering, it is about reinterpreting, seeing the same events without the same emotional environment. And that change in perspective can lead to a subtle awareness that something valuable was mishandled, that something stable was disrupted, that something consistent is no longer there. For you, this process is happening from a different place. You are not replaying from inside the dynamic. You are observing from outside it. Your clarity has already begun to form. You have already started to understand the patterns, the imbalances, the emotional cost. and that is why your engagement has changed. But on the other side, the replay is part of that process of understanding. It is not always complete, it is not always accurate, but it is a step toward recognizing that the dynamic has shifted in a way that cannot be easily reversed. Because once something is seen differently, it cannot be unseen. And once the absence of your presence is felt consistently, it cannot be ignored. This is why replaying the dynamic becomes such an important stage, not because it guarantees change, but because it introduces awareness. And awareness, even when incomplete, changes how the past is held. It creates a difference between what was experienced then and how it is understood now. And that difference is where the realization begins to take shape, quietly, gradually, without announcement, but with enough weight to be felt. Because when control is gone and the dynamic is no longer active in the same way, what remains is not just memory, it is reflection. And reflection over time has a way of revealing what was once overlooked. When someone begins to realize, even on a subtle level, that they have mishandled a connection, one of the most common responses is not direct accountability, but subtle re-entry. This is a phase that can be easily misunderstood, because it does not come with clear acknowledgement of what went wrong. Instead, it appears as a quiet return, a reappearance that seems casual on the surface but carries a deeper intention underneath, to regain access without confronting the past directly. This kind of re-entry is rarely bold. It does not usually begin with an apology or a clear statement of recognition. Instead, it starts small, a message that feels neutral, a check-in that seems harmless, something that does not require emotional vulnerability, but opens the door just enough to see if it is still accessible. From your perspective, this can feel confusing because it creates a sense of familiarity without resolution. It brings the connection back into view without addressing what caused it to break in the first place. And that lack of acknowledgement is significant because it reveals the approach. The goal is not necessarily to repair through understanding, it is to reconnect through access. There may be references to shared experiences, light conversation, moments that feel reminiscent of earlier stages of the relationship. And because these interactions are not heavy or confrontational, they can feel easier to engage with, safer even. But what is important to notice is what is missing. There is often no direct recognition of the hurt, no clear ownership of past behavior, no consistent effort to address the patterns that led to the distance. Instead, the interaction moves forward as if the past can be bypassed, as if connection can be restored without resolution. This is what makes subtle re-entry so powerful and so risky. Because it relies on your willingness to engage without requiring change on the other side. If you respond in the same way you once did, open, responsive, emotionally available, the dynamic can quickly begin to resemble what it was before. The same rhythm can return, the same patterns can reappear. And because the re-entry was smooth and non-confrontational, it can feel like progress, even when nothing fundamental has changed. This is why awareness is essential in this phase. Because subtle re-entry does not test whether the relationship can be rebuilt. It tests whether access is still available, whether the door is still open, whether the connection can be reactivated without addressing the reasons it was disrupted. You may also notice that the tone of these interactions is carefully balanced, not too intense, not too distant, just enough to maintain engagement without creating discomfort. This balance is not accidental. It is designed to avoid triggering resistance, to keep the interaction flowing without raising difficult questions, and in doing so, it can create a sense of ease that feels different from the tension that existed before. But ease is not the same as resolution, and comfort is not the same as change. For you, this is where your clarity becomes your guide, because you have already experienced the full dynamic. You have seen the patterns, you have felt the imbalance, and your distance did not come from nowhere. It came from understanding. So when subtle re-entry occurs, your role is not to reject it harshly or accept it automatically. It is to observe it, to notice what is present and what is not. Is there consistency over time? Is there accountability? Is there a willingness to address what happened? Or is the interaction simply moving forward without looking back? These questions shift your focus from the surface of the interaction to its substance, because without substance, re-entry remains part of the same cycle. And cycles repeat when they are not interrupted by change. This is why your response matters, not in a reactive sense, but in a conscious one, because every interaction either reinforces the old pattern or supports a new one. If you engage in the same way, the system recognizes familiarity. If you maintain your boundaries, the system recognizes change, and that recognition influences what happens next. Over time, if subtle re-entry does not lead to renewed access, it may lose its momentum, because without engagement, it cannot sustain itself. And if it does lead to engagement without change, the pattern may simply restart. This is the critical point, because the difference between repetition and transformation lies in what is addressed, not just what is resumed. For you, this phase is an opportunity, not to fix the past, but to protect your clarity, to ensure that connection is not restored at the cost of understanding. To recognize that re-entry without accountability is not resolution, it is continuation. And once you see that clearly, your decisions become more grounded. You are no longer drawn in by familiarity alone. You are guided by whether the foundation has changed, and if it has not, you are able to step back, not with confusion, but with certainty, because you understand that access without accountability leads back to the same place, and you have already been there. When your responses begin to change, when you are no longer reacting with the same urgency, no longer engaging with the same emotional intensity, one of the most immediate consequences is the emergence of frustration. This frustration does not always present itself loudly or dramatically, but it becomes visible in shifts of tone, in subtle pressure, and in the growing discomfort with your lack of familiar response. For a long time, your behavior may have followed a predictable pattern. You responded, you explained, you engaged. Even when there was conflict, there was still movement, an exchange that kept the connection active. Your emotional reactions, whether positive or negative, provided a kind of feedback that made the interaction feel alive and manageable. Now that feedback is reduced, and without it, the dynamic begins to feel uncertain. Because when someone is used to a certain level of emotional responsiveness, its absence is not neutral, it is noticeable. It creates a gap, a silence where there was once reaction, a pause where there was once engagement, and that gap can feel uncomfortable. At first, this discomfort may show up as confusion, questions about why you are different, why you are quieter, why you are not responding the way you used to. These questions are often framed as curiosity, but underneath them is a deeper need to understand the disruption, because your change disrupts the pattern, and disruption challenges expectations. When those expectations are not met, frustration begins to form. You may notice a shift in tone, messages that carry a slight edge, statements that feel less patient, a sense that your lack of response is creating tension rather than distance. This is not always expressed directly, but it is felt in the interaction, because your calmness, your distance, your reduced engagement, these are not matching the dynamic that once existed, and when something does not match expectation, it creates resistance. This resistance is what fuels frustration. There may be attempts to draw you back into the familiar pattern, questions that require answers, statements that invite reaction, moments that seem designed to provoke some kind of emotional response, any response, because even a small reaction confirms that the connection is still active, that the dynamic can still be influenced. But when those attempts do not produce the expected result, the frustration deepens. Because the usual methods are no longer effective, the pathways that once led to engagement are no longer reliable, and this creates a sense of loss, not always of the relationship itself, but of the ability to influence it. For you, this stage can feel uncomfortable if you are not aware of what is happening, because frustration has a way of pulling you back in. It creates pressure, a sense that something needs to be addressed, explained, or resolved. You may feel the urge to respond, not because you want to re-engage, but because you want to reduce the tension. This is where awareness becomes essential, because responding to frustration often restores the pattern. It brings back the exchange. It reactivates the dynamic. And while that may temporarily reduce discomfort, it also reinforces the expectation that your response can be triggered. But when you remain steady, when you do not match frustration with reaction, something important happens. The pattern begins to break. Because frustration relies on response, it depends on engagement to sustain itself. Without that engagement, it loses momentum. At the same time, your steadiness creates a different kind of message, not one that is spoken, but one that is demonstrated. That your emotional state is no longer easily influenced, that your behavior is no longer reactive, that your engagement is no longer automatic. And this message changes the dynamic, because it introduces something new. Boundaries that are maintained without confrontation. You are not arguing. You are not explaining. You are simply not participating in the same way. And that absence of participation is what makes the frustration more visible, because it highlights the difference between what was and what is now. For you, this is a moment of choice, not in terms of what to say, but in how to remain. Do you return to the familiar pattern to reduce discomfort? Or do you stay aligned with the clarity that led you to step back? Because your consistency is what determines whether the pattern continues or changes. Over time, if your responses remain steady, the frustration may shift. It may decrease. It may become less frequent. Not because everything has been resolved, but because the attempts to provoke a reaction are no longer producing results. And without results, the behavior adjusts. This is where your position becomes stable. Not because the other person has changed, but because you have. You are no longer responding out of habit. You are responding or choosing not to respond from awareness. And that awareness protects your emotional space. It allows you to remain calm in the presence of tension. It allows you to maintain distance without feeling the need to justify it. It allows you to step out of a cycle that once felt automatic, because when frustration no longer pulls you back in, it loses its power. And what remains is your clarity, steady, grounded, and no longer dependent on the reactions happening around you.